This is Short Stories, a production of the National Taichung University of Science and Technology Language Center. Today I have chosen to tell you a tale from The Yellow Fairy Book by Andrew and Nora Lang. The Langs collected, translated, and edited stories from all across Europe and published them in a series of children's books in the 1890s. I have edited it slightly to save time and to make it a little easier for non-native English speakers to understand, but most of the words are presented as the Langs wrote them. One additional change I made was to give the characters names. Very often in old fairy tales, the characters are nameless. This is because in old stories, the characters exist to serve the plot, which is the opposite of what we are used to today. The names I chose are based on the story's similarity with Greek mythology. Vocabulary: endow. Endow. Michael Jordan was endowed with amazing athletic talent. Grief. Grief. She felt immense grief over the loss of her child. Obsessed. Obsessed. Some people are obsessed with Japanese pop culture. Kidnap. Kidnap. Lex Luthor kidnapped Lois Lane. Enemy. Enemy. Lex Luthor is Superman's enemy. Mollify. Mollify. The mother mollified her baby with a pacifier. Locket. Locket. She kept a picture of her mother in her locket. Abscond. Abscond. The thief absconded from jail last night. The story. In very ancient times there lived a king, whose power lay not only in the vast extent of his dominions, but also in the magic secrets of which he was master. One day he met a princess of such remarkable beauty that he at once asked her to marry him. The princess, whose name was Cora, agreed, and the wizard king considered himself the happiest of men. A year later a son was born, whom they named Orpheus. He was worthy in every way of such distinguished parents, and much admired by the whole court. As soon as Queen Cora thought Prince Orpheus strong enough for a journey, she set out with him secretly to visit her fairy godmother. I said secretly because the fairy had warned her that wizards and fairies have been enemies since time immemorial. He might not approve of your visit. The fairy godmother was very pleased with the little prince. She endowed him with the power of easily learning everything which could help to make him an accomplished prince. Accordingly, to the delight of his teachers, he made the most rapid progress in his education, constantly surpassing everyone's expectations. Before he could inherit the throne, however, he had the great sorrow of losing his mother, whose last words were, "If you are ever in trouble, consult the fairy. She has sworn to protect you." Orpheus's grief at the death of his mother was great, but it was nothing compared to that of the king, his father, who was quite inconsolable for the loss of his dear wife. Neither time nor reason seemed to lighten his sorrow, and the sight of all the familiar faces and things about him only served to remind him of his loss. He therefore spent most of his time in his study, gazing into his crystal ball. "Will I ever find another as beautiful as my dear Cora?" he muttered. One day, while swiping through images of princesses on his crystal ball, the wizard king stumbled upon the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. "Be still, my beating heart," he said, as he stared in awe at the princess. The more he looked, the more obsessed he became. "I can't live without her," he whined. Using his magic arts, he discovered where she lived and took the form of an eagle. In this shape he flew across many countries and arrived at length at the princess's garden. A wide stream flowed through the garden, and on it floated richly ornamented barges and gondolas, filled with people dressed in the most elegant manner and covered with jewels. In one of these barges sat the queen of that country, Demi, with her only daughter, Persephone. The eagle perched on the top of a large orange tree, from which he was able to survey the scene and to gaze at pleasure on the princess's charms. He waited till he saw her in the act of stepping ashore, when, suddenly swooping down, he carried her off before her servant could take hold of her hand. Persephone, on finding herself in an eagle's talons, uttered the most heartbreaking shrieks and cries. But her captor, though touched by her distress, would not abandon his lovely prey, and continued to fly through the air too fast to allow him to say anything to comfort her. The wizard king flew all the way back to his own kingdom. Slowly he began to descend onto a flowery meadow. "Rest easy, princess," he said as he deposited her onto the grass. "Why did you kidnap me?" shouted the angry princess. After turning back into his human form, the wizard king explained that he planned to marry her and make her queen. "My only wish," he explained, "is to make you the happiest person in the world." "If that's true," replied the princess, "then let me go freely. Otherwise I can only look on you as my worst enemy." The wizard king touched his heart and said, "That cuts deep, princess, but maybe you'll feel differently after a few days in your own palace." Suddenly a magnificent palace sprang up at her feet. The architecture was imposing, and in the interior the rooms were furnished in the best possible taste. To hide his prize and to keep her isolated, the king finished things off by surrounding the palace in a thick mist. After a couple of days, the wizard king returned to see if the princess had changed her mind. She had not. Instead, she complained about being lonely. "I don't even have anyone to talk to," she moaned. "I can fix that," replied the wizard king, and with a flourish of his wand, he created a brilliantly colored parrot that said the most pleasant things. This did little to mollify Persephone, who could only regard him with feelings of hatred, which she was at no pains to conceal. The king hoped, however, that time might not only soften her anger, but accustom her to his sight. After returning to the court, the prince and all the nobles were delighted to see their beloved king again. But they had little time to chat, for the wizard king often found excuses to be absent from his official duties. "I must consult the books in my study," he said frequently. But this was really a pretext to spend more time with the princess, who remained inflexible. One day, Prince Orpheus approached his father and said, "Dad, the other nobles and I have been talking, and we're getting worried about your frequent absences. What are you doing in your study, anyway?" "None of your business," shouted the wizard king as he slammed the door. After that, the king began to worry that his son would find the princess and take her for himself. So he decided to send his son away on a lengthy diplomatic mission. On his journey, Prince Orpheus met many kings and queens. Finally, he came to the palace of Queen Demi. She greeted him warmly and held a state dinner in the royal dining hall. Over the fireplace in the dining hall hung a portrait of Princess Persephone. "Who is that?" asked Orpheus. Wiping a tear from her eye, Queen Demi replied, "That is my beloved daughter, who disappeared about a year ago." The prince listened to the queen's sad tale. He was deeply moved, and vowed that he would search the world for the princess. The queen assured him of her eternal gratitude and promised, should he succeed, to give him her daughter in marriage, together with all the estates she herself owned. As a token of this promise, she gave Prince Orpheus a locket with a portrait of Persephone inside. The prince embarked on his quest after taking leave of the queen. His first act was to seek the fairy under whose protection he had been placed. He implored her to use her magic to assist him. After listening attentively to the whole story, the fairy asked for time to consult her books. After due consideration, she informed the prince that the princess was not far away. "But you'll never reach her," she warned. "Your father has placed her in a magic palace, shrouded in mist." Orpheus asked how he might rescue her. The fairy tapped her chin as she thought for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to turn you into a parrot." And before Orpheus could object, the fairy waved her wand and turned him into an exact copy of the princess's parrot. After receiving instructions from the fairy, Orpheus set out once more, only this time he flew. Upon reaching the enchanted palace, the prince perched himself on the windowsill of Persephone's room. This was the first time he laid eyes on the princess in person, and was struck dumb by her beauty. "What's wrong, Polly?" asked Persephone. "Don't you want to chat with me?" Recovering his wits, Orpheus squawked, "I'm here to rescue you, princess." Persephone laughed and said, "What are you talking about?" Orpheus explained who he was and his mission. At first, Persephone didn't believe him, believing this to be one of the Wizard King's tricks. "My lady," squawked Orpheus, "I am here to rescue you on behalf of your mother. To prove it, behold this locket, which she gave me herself." So saying, he drew forth the locket from under his wing. The princess's surprise was great, and she could not control her outburst of joy. "Praise the Lord!" she shouted as she hugged the colorful bird. "Pull out one of my tail feathers," suggested Orpheus. The princess did as he asked, and he instantly turned back into a human prince. "Oh my!" said Persephone, "aren't you handsome?" Meanwhile, the fairy had prepared a chariot, to which she harnessed two powerful eagles. She conducted it to the window of the princess's dressing room. The princess, stepping into the chariot with the prince, was delighted to be free of the Wizard King's grasp. The Wizard King arrived at the palace not long after Persephone had absconded. When he failed to find her, he flew into a terrible rage, and hastened home to consult his books, by which means he discovered that it was his son who had deprived him of his precious treasure. Immediately he took the shape of a harpy, and, filled with rage, was determined to devour his son, and even the princess too, if only he could overtake them. When Queen Demi saw the daughter she had given up for lost, she fell on her knees and wept for joy. The fairy warned the queen that the Wizard King would shortly arrive, infuriated by his loss, and that nothing could preserve the prince and princess from his rage and magic unless they were actually married. The queen hastened to arrange the wedding, which took place on the spot. As the ceremony was completed, the Wizard King arrived. He was so angry and distraught that he attempted to sprinkle some magic poison over the bride and groom, which was intended to kill them. But the fairy stretched out her wand, and the liquid dropped on the magician himself. He fell down senseless and powerless. Prince Orpheus ran to check his father's pulse. "He's not quite dead," he exclaimed, relieved. The queen ordered that he be placed in prison. After the dust settled, Orpheus asked the fairy, "Why don't you move in with us? There's plenty of room in this castle." The fairy agreed, and she redecorated her new room in a magnificent fashion. After moving all of her stuff, she settled into her new home, where she enjoyed the sight of the perfect happiness she had helped to bestow on the entire royal family. And now the questions. Number 1. Why did Queen Cora meet the fairy in secret? A. She wanted to plan a surprise party for the Wizard King. B. She wanted to plan the Wizard King's murder. C. She didn't want her son to know. D. Her husband hated fairies. The answer is D. Her husband, the Wizard King, hated fairies. Question 2. How did Persephone feel about the Wizard King's marriage proposal? A. She enthusiastically agreed. B. She reluctantly agreed. C. She couldn't make up her mind. D. She strongly disagreed. The answer is D. She strongly disagreed. Question 3. How did Orpheus get into the secret palace? A. Through a secret tunnel. B. Through the chimney. C. By turning into a mouse. D. By turning into a bird. The answer is D. By turning into a bird. Question 4. What happened to the Wizard King at the end? A. He was executed. B. He was put in prison. C. He was banished. D. He was allowed to marry the princess. The answer is B. He was put in prison.